Social value is really important to Volker Wessels UK. We're really looking to engage with the wider community and have the opportunity to give back to those communities as part of our broader social value agenda. Volker Wessels UK are a multidisciplinary construction contractor. We work across a range of building and infrastructure activities throughout the UK. We have a diverse range of clients, from Network Rail to National Highways and a number of major private and public sector clients.
At Volker Wessels UK, we were capturing lots of different types of social value on different platforms, and it was becoming increasingly challenging to bring everything into one place without a lot of manual intervention. So we were looking for a system that could capture everything into one place quickly, easily, and allow for data to be manipulated and viewed in a simple way. The ability, for example, to notify people once a month when their metrics were due to be submitted was a real plus for us. It took the manual intervention out of the whole approach. Thrive has been a real catalyst for change within Volker Wessels UK. Since the implementation of the system, we've seen a 300% increase in the number of projects capturing social value. There is very little training that's required. I was immediately impressed with how simple to use it was, how flexible the solutions could be for us as a business. It didn't feel like an off-the-shelf package that was hardwired. The agility of the system and the desire to improve and make the system better and better all the time was really important for us.
They have certainly engaged and understood our needs and our priorities, and that's given us a great opportunity to tailor the platform according to the areas that we wanted to focus on initially, but then help us on the journey of developing the system to meet our broader needs and also consider our plans for the future. The Thrive platform has been very well received within our business. It's very straightforward, it's very simple, and we have seen our user numbers climb steadily since its implementation, and we're really surprised how easily our business has taken to the platform so quickly, enabling us to gather some really important social value metrics.
With the launch of the PPN, the Policy Procurement Notice 0620 on capturing social value, this was a real game changer for the industry, and we needed to respond quickly. What Thrive enables us to do is look at the requirements of the PPN, look at the requirements of our clients, and map those requirements to the impact evaluation standard metrics. And from there, when we're successful in bids, we can pull that straight through into a live project in the system. What we're also finding is that the ability to track the metrics in line with the PPN and also the social value model from a government perspective has enabled the strategy to be brought to life as well, because we can see the improvements that we're making month on month through the reporting functionality. The diversity and inclusion agenda is rapidly growing within Volker Wessels UK, and one of the main pulls for us for using the system is that not only can we use the impact evaluation standard for our main social value metrics, but we're also able to add non-social value adding metrics to the portal. So we can capture things around our social, our diversity and inclusion, and in the future more of our ESG requirements all in one place, rather than having everything disparate around the business. Social value isn't something that we can do by ourselves. We need to involve our supply chain and our subcontractors. One of the fabulous abilities within Thrive is that we can capture data from third parties. We can pull that in directly into the system, and then we can report on the whole social value impact that we're having on our projects. But we're also able to filter that out and just report on our own impact within communities and on the environment.
I recommend anyone considering Thrive as a platform for social value that you engage with the organisation and open those conversations so that they can understand what you're trying to achieve. We've certainly found that to be a key part of development of the system, and working with the people at Thrive has made it a very easy decision. And once we started those early conversations, for us there was really no going back.
I cannot recommend Thrive enough as a platform and as a partner to Volker Wessels UK.